Are
Of
there
course.
patterns that you've seen these customers implement, which are great, patterns to get started with, so they don't run into the pitfalls that you see other customers already in, where hey, they're bleeding tons of money because they're just doing something very inefficiently, and these new customers with greenfield projects are doing the right thing with your guidance to implement certain things a certain way. Where do you see the biggest impact or the biggest bang for the buck in terms of the new patterns that these new age products have implemented?
Yeah, and where to answer that, I think it's about being analytical and then ultimately taking the outputs of any action and then examining your results. So, what I would say the biggest bang for the buck is do the analysis to make sure that you're running your workload on the right service. There are some anti patterns that we have seen where someone will start on a particular service because they want to move
What's an
fast,
example of that?
right? And
What's an example of a service like that?
we had an example that recently was published out of Prime Video
Yeah,
where they were running long running jobs in Lambda as part of their quality of service and then doing QA over
right.
streams. And what they ultimately found was that because it's a long running job and you're basically going to run this all the time, they pivoted to using ECS rather than going with Lambda. And they did see cost savings from that. So where I'm going is do that analysis to make sure that you're running the right service for your application and then just iterate on it, right? It's about that circle that we think of when we think of DevOps. Always make sure that you're taking the feedback and looking at your cost to then make sure that you are running that right service for the workload.
So are there any particular ones where you implement it for a client and say, oh, we're so glad that we don't, I don't know, like with S3, right? We're so glad we don't have to maintain these big RAID arrays anymore. Or, I don't know, suppose getting off of their own authentication systems into Cognito. Like, what are people very excited about at the large scale?
I would say that the biggest thing that people are excited about right now is generative AI.
Okay, so you have lots of people asking when they're getting into the Bedrock beta.
All the time, right? So that one's going to be a huge launch when the service goes GA. One thing that I do want to touch on with the removal of that undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? So when you're thinking about what are some of those things that you used to have to do on premises that you're no longer doing once you're on AWS, right? You're not having to manage RAID arrays. You no longer have to allocate and provision for the appropriate amount of power and cooling, security in your own data center, and those things are part of the cost of AWS.
It's funny that you mentioned security, right? You're not meaning firewalls and IP filters and all that stuff. You're meaning the actual person at the door with the nightstick saying, "Don't run in here and steal our hard drives."
Exactly. And I read an article about that happened 2 weeks ago where a company found one of their hard drives on eBay
Right.
and it still had customer data on it, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that you don't have to worry about with AWS. For example, with our Nitro systems and how we do our hard drives, when you actually remove that, then it basically destroys the hard drive itself.
Well, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So we do have some of that security functionality because of the investments that we have made into our hardware. But another thing that comes out of that is then the folks that were in those positions, they have to change, right? And believe me, I understand that change is hard, and I'm super empathetic to that. What it does mean is that we have the opportunity to upskill and learn new positions that will drive deeper value for the company,
Yep.
right? Going back to that engineering perspective, there's always something new, a new pattern, a new language, right? So the way that I try to tell folks that are on the beginning of this cloud journey, whether I meet them through customer engagements, partner engagements, or even on LinkedIn, is I focus on two things, mind and body, right? I try to learn something new or study for at least 15 minutes a day because I think of the principle that an object in motion tends to stay in motion, right? And if I can just give myself that 15 minutes, then I keep going forward. I'm learning new things and then able to apply that back to my role.